The wind howled across the jagged peaks of the Apache Mountains, where Ethan Carver had pitched his tent on a ridge overlooking a vast, starlit valley. He was a rugged outdoorsman, 32 years old, with a weathered face that told tales of countless nights under the open sky. His campfire flickered weakly against the biting cold, casting long shadows on the rocky terrain. Ethan had come to this remote corner of New Mexico for solitude, seeking escape from the noise of city life and a recent breakup that still stung like a fresh wound. He adjusted his wool cap, pulling it low over his ears, and sipped lukewarm coffee from a tin mug, the bitter taste grounding him in the moment. The night was quiet, save for the wind and the occasional rustle of small creatures in the brush. He was alone, or so he thought. A faint crunch of footsteps on gravel snapped him to attention. His hand instinctively went to the hunting knife at his belt, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady but laced with caution. No answer came, only the wind, until a figure emerged from the shadows, a young woman, no older than 25, wrapped in a tattered blanket, her dark hair tangled and her face smudged with dirt. She was Apache, her features sharp and proud, but her eyes held a mix of defiance and desperation. "I'm freezing," she said, her voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. "Can I share your fire?" Ethan hesitated, his city-bred instincts warring with the unspoken code of the wilderness. "You help those in need." He nodded, gesturing to a spot near the fire. "Sit," he said gruffly, tossing another log onto the flames. She sank down, clutching the blanket tighter, her gaze fixed on the fire as if it held answers to questions she hadn't asked. Her name, she said, was Lena, and she'd been hiking the trails when a sudden storm separated her from her group. Ethan listened, skeptical but intrigued, noting the way her hands trembled, and not just from cold, he suspected, but something deeper. He offered her coffee, which she accepted with a small, guarded smile. As the fire crackled, warming the space between them, Ethan felt a shift, a subtle tension in the air. Lena's story didn't add up. Her boots were too clean for someone lost for days, and her eyes darted too often to the shadows, as if expecting pursuit. Yet, there was something magnetic about her, a quiet strength that made him want to trust her. Despite the warning bells in his mind, he leaned back, studying her, unaware that this chance encounter was about to unravel his carefully planned solitude in ways he could never have imagined. The night stretched on, the stars above indifferent to the drama unfolding below, as Ethan and Lena sat in uneasy companionship, two strangers bound by firelight and secrets. Character count, 4022. Lena's presence by the fire was like a spark in dry grass, unsettling, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Ethan watched her closely, his instincts honed from years of navigating both wilderness and human nature. She sipped the coffee, her hands steadying as the warmth seeped into her fingers, but her eyes never lingered on his for long. They flicked to the edges of the campsite, to the dark silhouette of the pines, as if she expected something or someone to emerge. Ethan tried to keep the conversation light, asking about her group, the trails she'd hiked, but her answers were vague, delivered with the practiced ease that only deepened his suspicion. "Lost my way in the storm," she said, shrugging, her blanket slipping to reveal a leather cord necklace with a small, carved pendant. It looked old, significant, but she tucked it away quickly when she noticed his gaze. Ethan shifted, poking the fire with a stick, sending embers spiraling into the night. "Storms out here can be brutal," he said, testing her. "Which trail were you on?" Lena paused, her lips parting as if searching for a name, then muttered something about the Crest Trail. Ethan's jaw tightened. The Crest Trail was miles away, and no storm had hit this range in days. He didn't call her out, thought not yet. Instead, he offered her a protein bar from his pack, which she took with a nod, tearing into it with a hunger that seemed genuine. As they sat, the wind carried a faint howl, not an animal, but something mechanical, distant, like an engine struggling against the terrain. Lena froze, her body tensing, and Ethan caught it, his own senses sharpening. "You hear that?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. She shook her head too quickly, muttering, "Just the wind." But her hands gripped the blanket tighter, and Ethan's gut told him she was lying. He leaned forward, his voice low. "Look, Lena, if you're in trouble, You can tell me. Out here, we're all we've got. Her eyes met his then, dark and searching, and for a moment, he thought she might confess, but she only smiled. A thin, unconvincing curve of her lips. Just cold and lost, she said, but the words felt like a mask. Ethan didn't push, not yet, but he made a mental note to keep his knife close. The fire burned lower, and he invited her to warm up in his tent, thinking only of sheltering her from the cold. She hesitated, then nodded, crawling inside with her blanket. As Ethan followed, zipping the tent flap behind them, he felt the weight of her presence, the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the cramped space. Outside, the distant engine sound faded, but the tension between them grew, a silent promise of truths yet to be uncovered. Character count, 4013. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the scent of damp canvas and the faint musk of Lena's blanket. Ethan's lantern cast a soft glow, illuminating the small space where their knees nearly touched as they sat cross-legged on his sleeping bag. He offered her a spare blanket, which she draped over her shoulders, her movements slow, deliberate, as if buying time. Ethan's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her story. She claimed to be a hiker, but her boots lacked the scuffs of a long trek, and her hands, though calloused, were too clean for someone stranded in the wild. He wanted to trust her. Her quiet demeanor and the way she clutched the pendant at her throat tugged at his empathy, but trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. "You warm enough?" he asked, breaking the silence. Lena nodded, her eyes fixed on the lantern's flame, avoiding his gaze. "Thanks for this," she said softly, her voice carrying a trace of an accent Ethan couldn't place. He leaned back against his pack, trying to seem at ease, but his hand rested near his knife, just in case. The wind outside battered the tent, a low moan that seemed to echo the unease between them. "So, your group," Ethan said, probing gently. "They'll be looking for you, right?" Lena's fingers tightened on the blanket, and she gave a vague nod. "Yeah, probably." Her tone was flat, unconvincing, and Ethan's suspicion deepened. He decided to change tack, sharing a story of his own. At a time he'd gotten lost in the Rockies, hoping to draw her out. She listened, her face softening slightly, but offered little in return. Then, without warning, she shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his. "You're kind," she said, her voice low, almost intimate. Ethan froze, caught off guard by the sudden shift in her demeanor. Her eyes, now locked on his, held a warmth that hadn't been there before, but it felt calculated, like a move in a game he didn't yet understand. "Just doing what anyone would," he replied, his voice steady despite the quickening of his pulse. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and leaned closer still, her breath warm against his cheek. For a moment, he thought she might be flirting, but something in her gaze, a sharp, almost predatory, told him this wasn't about warmth or attraction. The distant engine sound returned, closer now, and Lena's smile faltered. She pulled back, her body tensing, and Ethan's instincts screamed that she was hiding something big. He kept his expression neutral, but his mind was on high alert. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, giving her one last chance to come clean. She nodded, but her eyes betrayed her, darting to the tent flap as if expecting it to burst open. The night outside grew louder, and Ethan knew whatever was coming, it was closer than either of them wanted to admit. Character count, 4004. The tension in the tent was palpable, a taut thread stretched between Ethan's wariness and Lena's guarded silence. The lantern's light flickered, casting fleeting shadows that danced across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the unease in her eyes. Ethan kept his posture relaxed, but his senses were razor-sharp, attuned to every sound of the wind, the distant hum of that engine, and the faint rustle of Lena's blanket as she shifted. He wanted answers, but pushing too hard could scare her off, or worse, provoke whatever she was running from. "You don't talk much, do you?" he said, trying to lighten the mood. Lena's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Not much to say," she replied, but her voice carried a weight that contradicted her words. She reached for the coffee mug again, her fingers brushing his as she took it, and Ethan felt a jolt, and not of attraction, but of something deeper, like a warning. Her touch lingered a fraction too long, and he wondered if she was testing him, gauging his reaction. He decided to play along, leaning slightly closer, mirroring her earlier move. "Out here, people usually have a story," he said, his tone conversational but probing. "What's yours?" Lena's eyes flickered, and for a moment, he thought she might open up. Instead, she deflected, asking about his life, his reasons for camping alone in such a remote place. Ethan gave her the short version: a city burnout, a bad breakup, the need for quiet, but he kept the details vague, matching her secrecy with his own. The engine sound grew louder, unmistakable now, a low growl that seemed to circle the ridge. Lena's hand froze midair, the mug trembling slightly. "That's no hiker," Ethan said, his voice low, watching her reaction. She didn't deny it this time, her face paling as she set the mug down. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan leaned in, his heart pounding, ready for the truth. "I'm not lost," she admitted, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "I'm hiding." Before he could ask from what, a sharp crack echoed outside, a branch snapping under a heavy boot. Lena's breath caught, and she grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "They're here," she whispered, her voice laced with fear. Ethan didn't know who they were, but the urgency in her eyes told him they weren't friendly. He reached for his knife, his mind racing with possibilities: poachers, smugglers, or something worse. The tent felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the sounds outside grew closer. Ethan met Lena's gaze, a silent agreement forming between them. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together, at least for now. The air in the tent, once a haven of warmth, grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy Elias could not name but felt in the marrow of his bones. Leonu's humming grew slightly louder, weaving through the noise of the storm, a thread of primal sound connecting the small canvas shelter to the vast, wild darkness outside. Her eyes, when they flicked back to him, held no trace of the vulnerability he had seen before. Instead, they were pools of dark, ancient resolve. She was no longer a girl, she was an instrument of something far older and more formidable. Elias's hand itched to reach for his Colt, but a deep, instinctual warning screamed at him not to make a sudden move. He was in the presence of a power he did not understand, a predator he had foolishly invited into his den. He tried to speak, to break the spell with the blunt force of his own reality, but his voice emerged as a dry croak. What are you doing?" Leonu did not answer with words. Instead, she opened her hand, and from a small pouch at her waist that he hadn't noticed before, she took a pinch of fine, dark powder. With a sharp, breathy exhalation, she blew it towards the stove. The powder hit the metal surface and did not burn, but instead erupted into a cloud of fragrant smoke that smelled of pine resin, dried blood, and desert sage. The smoke did not dissipate normally, it coiled and twisted in the air, forming vague, shifting shapes that seemed to watch him. The temperature in the tent plummeted. It was no longer the cold of winter, but a deep, supernatural chill that seeped into his soul. The flame in the stove guttered and turned a sickly, pale green. The wind outside fell silent. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than its previous fury. In that absolute quiet, broken only by Leonu's low, continuous hum, Elias heard something else, the soft, unmistakable crunch of a footstep on the frozen ground just outside the tent. Then another, and another. They were not the footsteps of one person, they were the footsteps of many, moving with the stealth that was utterly predatory, surrounding his tent. He was trapped. The girl had not been lost. She had been the bait, the dist,